The grand mansion of Michael was alive with laughter, chatter, and the soft clinking of champagne glasses. Guests in sharp tuxedos and elegant gowns mingled beneath crystal chandeliers that sparkled like diamonds, their reflections dancing across the glossy marble floors. The house was a blend of old-world charm and modern luxury, with towering windows that framed a breathtaking view of the lush, manicured gardens outside. It was a scene that could have come straight out of a fairy tale, a world of wealth, power, and prestige. In the midst of this opulence stood Isabella Michael, a woman of striking beauty and razor-sharp elegance. Her silver gown shimmered in the dim light, and her perfectly styled hair framed her face, which bore the mask of polite social grace. As she glided from one conversation to another, a slow smile tugged at her lips every time someone complimented her or fawned over her marriage to Michael. He was a successful businessman, and together, they made the perfect power couple. But beneath the surface of Isabella's polished appearance was a cruel and manipulative nature that few had seen, and fewer still dared to confront. Isabella reveled in the wealth and status that her marriage brought her, and she wasn't shy about using her position to maintain control over everyone around her. To the outside world, she was a gracious hostess, the epitome of class, but behind closed doors, she was a woman who would stop at nothing to secure her place at the top. And tonight, she had her sights set on making sure that every person in this room, from the lowliest servant to the wealthiest guest, knew who was in charge. Her husband, Michael, a man of integrity and fair judgment, was blissfully unaware of just how far his wife would go to maintain their luxurious lifestyle. Among the sea of well-dressed faces, one figure stood in stark contrast. Sarah, the new maid, moved quietly through the crowd, her plain black dress a sharp contrast to the designer gowns and tuxedos around her. She moved with practiced grace, serving drinks, collecting empty glasses, and quietly keeping to the background, where she was meant to be. Though she could feel the weight of the guests' eyes on her, Sarah kept her head down, focused on her duties. She had always been proud of her work, grateful for the opportunity to support her family and make ends meet. It was the way she was raised, to work hard, to be honest, and to never expect anything more than what she earned. Tonight was no different. She was accustomed to these kinds of events, lavish parties thrown by rich families in enormous mansions. But tonight, something felt different. Isabella's eyes seemed to follow her as she moved about the room. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible thing, but Sarah could feel the weight of her gaze. Isabella had been watching her closely all evening, and Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. As she balanced a tray of drinks, the tension in the air grew unbearable. It didn't take long for her worst fear to come true. As Sarah turned to offer a drink to one of the guests, she stumbled. The tray slipped from her hands, and a glass of red wine flew through the air, splashing across Isabella's shimmering silver gown. Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched in horror, the dark stain spreading across the fabric in a grotesque contrast to the elegance of the gown. The room fell silent. The laughter and chatter ceased as all eyes turned toward the scene unfolding in front of them. Sarah stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the room's judgment pressing down on her. Isabella's face twisted with fury, her expression turning from one of icy control to one of raw, unfiltered rage. She took a slow, deliberate step toward Sarah, her eyes narrowing with disdain. "How dare you?" Isabella's voice rang out, sharp and cruel. The guests watched in stunned silence, some with pity, others with curiosity, but none daring to intervene. "Do you have any idea what you've just done? This dress costs more than your entire life will ever be worth." Sarah's stomach twisted in knots, but she refused to let her fear show. She knew better than to beg for forgiveness. She had worked in high society before, and she knew how they treated people like her. People who were invisible until they were needed and disposable once their duties were done. But tonight, she wasn't going to apologize. Not for a simple accident. Not for something beyond her control. She straightened her back and met Isabella's furious gaze. "I'm sorry, ma'am," she said quietly, her voice steady. "But it was an accident." Isabella's lips curled into a sneer. "An accident?" she repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I think it's more than that. I think you're a worthless maid who doesn't know her place. The words stung, but Sarah refused to flinch. She had heard worse in her life. The disdain in Isabella's voice was nothing new to her. But what happened next caught everyone off guard. Actually, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, I know your real story, Isabella. The room fell silent again, the guests exchanging confused glances. Isabella's face, which had been twisted in anger, now faltered, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. Sarah, emboldened by the weight of her own words, took a step forward, her voice low but firm. I know everything about you, she said. I have proof of the things you've done to get where you are, and I'm not afraid to show it. The guests leaned in, whispers rippling through the room. Isabella's composed exterior began to crack. The pride she had carried with her all evening was replaced by a flicker of fear. For the first time, she was not in control. Sarah had something on her, a truth that could bring her empire of lies crumbling down. And the night was just beginning. The atmosphere in the room was charged with a kind of electric anticipation. Isabella stood there, her lips tightly pressed together, her hands trembling at her sides. The guests, who had been eager to witness the scandalous fallout from Sarah's accident, now found themselves frozen in uncertainty. No one dared to speak, but all eyes were locked on the maid standing at the center of the storm. Isabella took a deep breath, trying to regain control, her mask of poise returning slowly, but the fury was still visible in her eyes. Her lips curled in a thin, dangerous smile, and her gaze shifted from Sarah to the gathered crowd, seeking support and ally. But no one dared to speak up, their attention riveted to what was unfolding in front of them. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Isabella's voice was low, but dripping with venom. You've ruined my evening, ruined my dress, and most importantly, you've humiliated me in front of my guests. Her words were like daggers, each one a reminder of the power she had once wielded over everyone in this room, and how quickly it was slipping away. But Sarah stood tall, her eyes unwavering. She could feel her heart racing in her chest, but her hands remained steady. She had seen worse, many times before. The rich and powerful were often cruel, especially to those who served them, but Sarah had grown up with the understanding that power was just an illusion. It was a game played by the wealthy, one that was always stacked in their favor. She knew she wasn't playing by their rules anymore, though. Tonight, she was in control. Is that how you see me, Isabella? Sarah asked, her voice calm yet filled with a quiet defiance. Just a maid, a nobody? She took a step forward, her eyes not leaving Isabella's. You can say whatever you want about me, but I won't let you hide behind your lies any longer. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and the room held its breath. Isabella's smile faltered for just a moment before it twisted back into a cruel sneer. You think I care about your opinion? You're a servant, a nobody, who doesn't know her place, she spat. And you'll never be anything more than that. You'll always be beneath me. The guests stood in stunned silence. Many of them had never seen Isabella like this, so unhinged, so out of control. They had all known her as the perfect socialite, the woman who held sway over everyone around her. But now, she was just a woman backed into a corner, lashing out in anger. But Sarah wasn't afraid. The venom in Isabella's words had no power over her anymore. She had known this woman for what she truly was the moment she stepped into the mansion. Isabella wasn't the queen of this castle. Sarah had long since realized that the true power came from the truth, and the truth was something Isabella could never hide. Go ahead, try to destroy me with your words, Sarah continued, her voice cool and steady. But it won't change the fact that I have everything I need to expose your lies. Your world will fall apart the moment I show them what you've been hiding. Isabella's eyes widened in disbelief. She had expected Sarah to cower, to beg for forgiveness, to apologize profusely for ruining her night. Instead, she was being confronted head-on. This was a battle of wills, and for the first time, Isabella realized she might have underestimated her. The room was silent. The tension was so thick, it felt as though it might snap at any moment. Guests exchanged nervous glances, their fascination with the unfolding drama mingled with a growing discomfort. No one knew how to react. And then, the voice of one of the guests cut through the tension. What do you mean, Sarah? What truth are you talking about? It was Thomas, a friend of Michael's and a longtime acquaintance of Isabella's. His voice was filled with curiosity, but there was also a hint of apprehension. Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to face him, her expression calm, yet filled with the weight of everything she was about to reveal. Slowly, she reached into her bag, pulling out a thick envelope. The rustling of paper was the only sound as she held it up, her gaze steady on Isabella, who looked as though she might collapse under the weight of the moment. "I have records," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "Evidence of Isabella's dealings, of the lies she's told, of the money she's stolen from her husband." The room went completely still, and Sarah's words landed like a heavy blow. Isabella's face went pale as she realized that Sarah wasn't bluffing. The guests, who had been watching in stunned silence, now leaned in closer, murmuring to each other, their interest piqued. The game had changed. No longer was this just a simple mistake made by a maid. It was now a confrontation between truth and deception, and the truth was slowly gaining ground. You have no idea what you're talking about." Isabella's voice wavered for the first time, a flicker of fear crossing her features. "You don't know anything about me?" She was trying to regain her composure, but it was slipping away fast. Her perfect facade, the one she had spent years cultivating, was beginning to crack, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But Sarah wasn't finished. With deliberate care, she opened the envelope and pulled out a series of documents, each one bearing the unmistakable marks of official records. "I know more than you think," Sarah said, her tone cold and unyielding. "I've been digging through the files your husband doesn't even know about. Your manipulations, your underhanded deals, the money you've siphoned from your marriage. All of it's right here." She held up the documents, letting the room get a glimpse of the incriminating evidence. The guests gasped as they realized the depth of what Sarah was saying. The atmosphere shifted. What had begun as an elegant evening had now turned into an unraveling of secrets. Michael, who had been quietly observing from the side, stepped forward. He had been silent until now, but the evidence in Sarah's hands seemed to pierce through the fog of his confusion. He looked at Sarah, his eyes narrowing in disbelief. "What's all this?" he demanded, his voice low, his disbelief palpable. Sarah met his gaze steadily, offering the papers to him. "Everything you need to see, Michael. The truth about your wife." As Michael took the papers from Sarah's hands, Isabella's face turned a shade of red that no amount of makeup could hide. The room was watching now, the once celebrated wife of the house being exposed for the fraud she truly was. This was the moment when the carefully constructed walls of Isabella's life came crumbling down. Michael's eyes scanned the documents, and it was clear from the growing horror in his face that he was starting to grasp the extent of his wife's betrayal. The wealth, the lies, the power plays. All of it had been part of a carefully orchestrated plan to deceive him and everyone around her. And now, in front of their entire circle of friends, she had been unmasked. "I never thought you were capable of this, Isabella," Michael said, his voice hoarse with shock and disappointment. "You've been stealing from me, from us for years." The words cut through the tension like a blade, and the silence in the room became deafening. Isabella opened her mouth to protest, but the weight of Michael's gaze, filled with disgust and disbelief, left her speechless. She had no defense. The room remained silent as Michael's shock deepened with each passing second. The paper in his hands seemed to grow heavier, each word on the documents a new betrayal, a new revelation about the woman he had trusted for so many years. Isabella stood there, her expression frozen, unable to speak as she realized that the perfect life she had constructed had just collapsed around her. The guests, once eager to mingle in their luxurious surroundings, now whispered among themselves, their conversations hushed, tense with the weight of the scandal unfolding before them. They watched with wide eyes as the powerful matriarch of the household, the woman they had admired and envied, was brought to her knees by the very woman she had so ruthlessly tried to humiliate. Michael's face twisted in a mix of anger, disbelief, and sorrow. He was no longer the calm, collected businessman that everyone knew him to be. His hands shook slightly as he scanned the incriminating files. How could you do this to me, Isabella? After everything we've built, after everything I've done for you. Isabella's eyes flickered with panic. She had no defense, no way to explain the trail of deception that was now laid bare for everyone to see. She opened her mouth to speak, to beg, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time in her life, Isabella Michael felt completely powerless. How long were you planning to keep this up? Sarah's voice cut through the air, calm and steady as she continued to press the point. How long were you going to live this lie? She paused, allowing the words to sink in. Your marriage, your empire, your wealth, it was all built on manipulation and deceit. Michael didn't look at her. His focus remained solely on his wife. I don't know what to say to you anymore, he said quietly, his voice breaking. I've been so blind. The pain in his voice was palpable, and it reverberated through the room, drawing sympathetic glances from the onlookers. For a long moment, there was only silence. Isabella stood frozen, her face pale, as if the life had been drained from her. She had always been the one in control, the one pulling the strings behind the scenes. But now, she was a mere shadow of that woman. The facade had crumbled, and the truth was spilling out like a flood she couldn't stop. The guests, who had initially been uncomfortable with the intensity of the confrontation, now found themselves swept up in the drama. They whispered amongst themselves, trying to make sense of what had just transpired. But in the back of the room, Sarah remained a silent figure, watching as everything Isabella had worked so hard to protect came crashing down. I never wanted this to happen, Sarah said quietly, though her words carried the weight of the moment. I didn't want to ruin anyone's life, but I couldn't stand by and watch you tear everything apart just to keep up your image. The words stung, and Isabella flinched as though struck physically. Sarah wasn't done. She had come too far to back down now. I'm not the one who ruined your marriage, Isabella, she continued, her voice growing stronger. You did that all on your own. You turned your life into a house of cards, and now it's fallen. As the room held its breath, Michael turned his back on his wife for the first time in their marriage. I think it's time for you to leave, Isabella, he said, his voice heavy with finality. I'm done. You've betrayed me in ways I can't even begin to understand. But this is the last straw. The word divorce hung in the air, a chilling finality settling over everything. Isabella opened her mouth to argue, to beg, but there was nothing she could say that would undo the damage she had done. The revelation of her betrayal had been so complete, so thoroughly laid bare, that even her charm, her manipulation, her beauty, none of it could save her now. Michael's decision was made. I'll be leaving, Isabella said finally, her voice hollow and broken. But don't think for a second this is over. Her words were sharp, but they lacked the conviction they once had. You'll regret this, Michael. You'll regret all of it. Michael didn't even turn to look at her. I doubt that, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. As Isabella turned to leave, her once proud head held high, there was no dignity left in her steps. She was walking away from everything she had spent years building, her wealth, her power, and her place in the high society that had once worshipped her. And as she exited the room, the guests slowly began to disperse, their whispers now filled with a mixture of gossip and disbelief. The grand evening had turned into an embarrassing spectacle, one that no one would soon forget. With Isabella gone, the guests trickled out of the mansion, unsure of how to process the evening's events. The party that had been meant to celebrate wealth and success had become a night of reckoning, and no one knew where to place their attention anymore. But Michael didn't care. He stood there, in the center of the room, still holding the papers Sarah had handed him, his heart heavy with the weight of everything he had just learned. For the first time in years, Michael felt like a fool. He had built an empire, one of success and prestige, but it had been built on a lie. Everything, his marriage, his wealth, the life he thought he knew, had been manipulated by the woman he loved. And as the truth about Isabella's betrayals and crimes spread before him, a wave of disappointment crashed over him, drowning out everything else. Sarah, who had been standing silently in the background, stepped forward, her eyes softening as she looked at him. I'm sorry you had to find out this way, she said, her voice filled with quiet empathy. But you deserve the truth. Michael turned to her, his expression unreadable. "I never saw it coming," he muttered. "I never thought she was capable of this." "I don't think anyone did," Sarah said gently. "But the truth always has a way of coming to light, no matter how hard we try to hide it." The two of them stood there for a moment, the weight of the night settling on their shoulders. It was hard for Michael to even look at Sarah as anything more than a servant, but in that moment, he saw her differently. She had just handed him his life back. She had given him the truth, and with it, the strength to face the destruction of everything he had known. "You've been more than just a maid to me, Sarah," Michael said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been the only one who's shown me loyalty, the only one who's had the courage to stand up to her. I owe you more than I can say." For the first time in what felt like years, Michael allowed himself to feel something other than the weight of betrayal. Gratitude, deep, genuine gratitude, washed over him. And in that moment, he knew that the woman standing before him had become more than just an employee. She had become someone he could trust, someone who had helped him regain the dignity he thought he'd lost forever. As the night wore on and the mansion grew quieter, Michael knew that a new chapter was about to begin. The end of his marriage was just the start. What lay ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Michael was ready to face whatever came next. And Sarah, who had never expected anything more than a paycheck, found herself standing alongside him, ready to face the future, no longer as a maid, but as an ally and, perhaps, something more. The next morning dawned, and the mansion that had once been filled with the hum of luxury and elite conversations now felt eerily silent. Michael sat in the large, sun-drenched study, the weight of the events from the previous night pressing down on him. His hands were clenched around a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid swirling as he stared out the window. The truth about Isabella's betrayal had not yet fully settled in his mind. It felt like a storm had come through, tearing apart everything he thought he knew. There was a knock on the door, and before Michael could respond, Sarah stepped in, her expression neutral, but the concern in her eyes was clear. "You're still here," she said softly, walking into the room. "I thought you might want to talk." Michael didn't respond immediately. His mind was too clouded, too full of conflicting thoughts. But Sarah's presence, steady and calm, seemed to anchor him, even if just for a moment. "I'm fine," he said, his voice hoarse from the night's emotions. "It's just hard to process all of this. I feel like I've been living in a lie." Sarah nodded, understanding the deep sense of betrayal he was feeling. "I know," she said gently, "but you have the truth now. It's painful, but it's also freeing, in a way. You don't have to live in that lie anymore." The room grew quiet as Michael continued to stare out the window, the weight of his thoughts heavy on his shoulders. Sarah stood there for a long moment, allowing him the space he needed to collect his thoughts. She knew he had a long road ahead of him, one full of difficult choices, but for now, she was content to be there, a quiet presence offering support without saying a word. Finally, Michael spoke, his voice firm but carrying an undercurrent of resolve. "I'm going to confront her," he said, the words leaving his mouth with finality. "I need to hear it from her own mouth. I need to know why she did this, why she betrayed me like this." Sarah didn't hesitate. "I think you're right," she said, her eyes locking with his. "You deserve answers. But remember, Michael, the truth is a painful thing to confront. She may not give you the answers you want." Michael nodded, standing up from his chair and walking toward the door. "I don't care anymore. I need to know." With one last look at Sarah, he added, "Thank you for everything." Sarah watched him leave, her heart heavy with the knowledge that his confrontation with Isabella would be one of the most difficult moments of his life. But she also knew it was necessary. Michael needed closure, and he deserved to hear the truth, no matter how ugly it was. As Michael made his way to the lavish apartment where Isabella had stayed after the previous night's revelations, his heart thudded painfully in his chest. He wasn't sure what he would find, but he knew he had to face it. He couldn't run from this anymore. The penthouse loomed ahead of him, a stark reminder of the life he had once shared with Isabella. As he entered the building and made his way up to her apartment, the familiar scent of expensive perfume and polished surfaces seemed to mock him. How many years had he spent here, thinking everything was perfect? How many nights had he come home, eager to see her smile, unaware that she had been slowly unraveling their life from within? When he knocked on the door, the sound of footsteps approached. Isabella appeared, her face pale, her expression carefully neutral, though her eyes betrayed the anxiety that bubbled beneath the surface. She had always prided herself on her appearance, on keeping control of every situation. But now, she looked lost, her carefully constructed world crumbling around her. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cold and distant, but Michael could see the flicker of fear behind her eyes. She knew what was coming. "I need answers," Michael said, his voice steady but firm. "I need to know why you did this to me. To us." Isabella stepped back, as though to invite him in, but her movements were stiff, mechanical. "I don't owe you anything," she said, her tone rising slightly in defense. "You have no idea what it's like, trying to keep everything together, to make sure nothing falls apart." Michael's brow furrowed. "I don't understand. I gave you everything. I trusted you. I loved you. And this is how you repay me?" For a moment, Isabella didn't respond. She looked away, her lips trembling as if she were searching for the right words to say, or perhaps the courage to say them. Finally, her gaze met his and she spoke, her voice low and trembling. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she whispered, the veil of her arrogance slipping just slightly. "I didn't want it to go this far, but I had to. I had to protect myself, Michael. You have no idea how much pressure I've been under, how hard I've worked to maintain this life. You were always so focused on the business, on the empire. I was the one who had to keep everything in place. And sometimes I had to do things I'm not proud of, to make sure we stayed on top." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he listened to her words. It wasn't the admission he had been hoping for, but it was the truth. A truth laced with self-justification, a plea for understanding. But no matter how hard she tried to explain, he couldn't forgive her. The betrayal cut too deep. "You were never alone, Isabella," Michael said, his voice low and filled with disbelief. "I was here. I would have helped you. But instead, you chose to deceive me. You chose to destroy everything we built." The silence that followed was suffocating. Isabella opened her mouth to say something, but no words came. She had no defense left, and the weight of her own actions was beginning to crush her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Michael turned away. "I'm done," he said, his voice final. "Our marriage is over." He left the apartment without looking back, the finality of his decision hanging in the air. There was no going back from this. Isabella had lost everything, and there was no longer any place for her in Michael's life. Isabella stood in the middle of her apartment, staring at the door Michael had just walked through. His words echoed in her mind, each one a painful reminder of the life she had destroyed. She had tried to justify her actions, tried to explain that it was all for the greater good, but it hadn't worked. Michael was gone. Her marriage was over, and there was no one left to blame but herself. She sank to the floor, the weight of everything pressing down on her chest. She had spent so many years building her perfect life, manipulating people and situations to keep her place at the top, but now it was all falling apart. The empire, the wealth, the respect she had once commanded, they were all gone. For the first time in a long while, Isabella felt truly powerless. She had never experienced anything like this. She had always been the one in control, the one who held all the cards, but now she was left with nothing. No marriage, no support, no one who cared enough to stand by her side. As the reality of her situation sank in, Isabella realized that she had sacrificed everything for the sake of power and control. She had lost sight of what truly mattered, the love, the trust, the partnership that had once defined her marriage. And now, it was too late to fix it. The tears came, unbidden, and for the first time in years, Isabella allowed herself to cry. The woman who had always prided herself on her strength and control was now broken, shattered by the very lies she had so carefully constructed. She had nothing left. As Michael left Isabella's apartment, the oppressive weight of the confrontation still hung in the air, but his steps felt heavier now, as though the ground itself was pulling him down. He had been so sure that facing Isabella would give him clarity, but instead, it had left him with an empty feeling, as though he had just put an end to a chapter in his life but was unsure of what would come next. Michael knew he couldn't go home just yet. He needed space. He needed time to process. So, he made his way to a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place he and Sarah had often visited when life felt overwhelming. He didn't expect her to be there, but part of him hoped she would be. He had no idea how much he needed her until now. Sarah had been by his side through so much already. She had stood beside him when the world had been spinning out of control, offering him an unwavering sense of stability. Michael knew that if there was anyone who could help him find his way through the aftermath of the storm Isabella had unleashed, it was Sarah. When he stepped into the cafe, the familiar scent of roasted coffee beans greeted him, and his eyes immediately searched the room. At the far corner, he spotted her, sitting with a book in front of her, her brow furrowed in concentration. She was the picture of calm, an anchor in a sea of chaos. Sarah looked up as Michael approached, her expression softening the moment she saw the exhaustion and sorrow in his eyes. She didn't ask any questions. She didn't need to. She simply stood up and gave him a warm embrace, one that spoke volumes without a single word. "How are you holding up?" she asked as they sat down together, her tone gentle but filled with genuine concern. Michael took a deep breath, finally allowing himself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. "I thought confronting her would bring me peace," he said quietly, "but it didn't. I feel more lost than ever." Sarah nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "You did what you needed to do, Michael. Sometimes, facing the truth doesn't immediately make things better, but it's the first step toward healing. You're going to be okay." He looked at her, a flicker of appreciation crossing his face. Sarah had always been there for him, and for the first time, he recognized how much she had come to mean to him. She wasn't just a friend. She was the one person who had never betrayed him, the one person who had remained constant while everything around him crumbled. "You're right," he said after a long pause, his voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "But it's going to take time. I don't know what comes next. I don't even know who I am anymore." Sarah reached across the table and placed a hand on his. "You're still you, Michael, and I'll be here every step of the way." The words meant more to him than he could express. For so long, he had been focused on the empire he had built, the life he had crafted with Isabella, and the reputation he had worked so hard to protect. But now, he realized that those things were all just illusions. The only thing that truly mattered was the people who stood by him through thick and thin. The people like Sarah. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't deserve someone like you." Sarah smiled, her eyes kind. "You don't have to deserve me, Michael. You've always been enough." And in that moment, Michael knew that the next chapter of his life wasn't going to be about rebuilding his empire or recovering from the pain Isabella had caused. It was going to be about something much more meaningful, about rediscovering who he was and learning to live for himself, not for anyone else. Part 10. A New Beginning. As the weeks passed, Michael began to rebuild his life. He finalized his divorce from Isabella, and the weight of that decision, heavy as it was, finally started to lift from his shoulders. The painful, soul-crushing days that had followed the confrontation had slowly turned into quiet evenings spent in contemplation, reflection, and, most importantly, healing. He focused on his work, but with a newfound clarity. No longer was he driven by the need to prove himself or maintain a facade of perfection. His business, while still important, took on a new meaning. Michael was no longer chasing after power or control. He was working to create something that would make a real difference, something that would stand the test of time and be a reflection of his true self. Through it all, Sarah remained by his side. She had become his rock, the person he could lean on when the days felt overwhelming. She had been there for him during the darkest moments, but now, she was there for him as he embraced the light of a new beginning. It wasn't just Sarah's support that was helping him rebuild. Michael had begun to trust himself again. He was learning to listen to his own instincts, to trust his own judgment. The man who had once been consumed by the opinions of others, by the expectations placed upon him, was starting to find his own voice. One evening, As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, Michael and Sarah walked through the park. The air was crisp, and the sound of their footsteps echoed through the quiet paths. "I never imagined this," Michael said, looking out at the cityscape. "I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I had it all. But now, I realize I was only running away from myself." Sarah smiled, the warmth of her presence filling the space between them. "You're not running anymore," she said softly. "You're finally free." Michael nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep within him. "Yes, I am." And as they walked side by side, the future seemed brighter than it had in years. Michael knew there would still be challenges ahead, but he also knew he had the strength to face them. He wasn't alone anymore. He had Sarah, and more importantly, he had himself. The past was behind him, and a new chapter was just beginning. One filled with hope, possibilities, and the promise of a life built on trust, love, and the courage to be true to himself. The story ended not with an extravagant gesture or a dramatic conclusion, but with a quiet, hopeful step forward into the unknown. For Michael, this was the start of something real, something lasting. And for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to embrace it. The days of deception, betrayal, and lost dreams were now a distant memory for Michael. In the quiet moments of his life, he could reflect on everything that had brought him here. The painful truths, the heart-wrenching losses, and the unexpected allies who had helped him along the way. But most of all, he realized how much he had grown. The man who once craved power and perfection had learned to embrace vulnerability, to value authenticity, and to trust in the people who truly mattered. He no longer measured success by the size of his empire or the number of zeros in his bank account. Now, success meant living a life filled with integrity, love, and the courage to face each day as his true self. And Sarah, steadfast and unwavering, was there by his side. They had built a friendship that had weathered the storm of his darkest moments, and now they were embarking on a new journey, one where the future wasn't defined by the shadows of the past, but by the bright light of possibility. As they stood together in the garden of Michael's new home, watching the sun rise over the horizon, Michael felt a deep sense of peace. The life he had lost was gone, but in its place, a new chapter had begun, one filled with promise, hope, and the quiet joy of knowing that he was exactly where he needed to be. With Sarah beside him, Michael knew that no matter what the future held, he was ready to face it. And this time, he would do it on his own terms. The past was a memory, the present was a gift, and the future was his to create. And so, with a heart full of hope and a mind clear of doubt, Michael stepped forward, ready for whatever came next. Thank you so much for listening to the full story and for watching the video. We truly appreciate your time and support. If you enjoyed the story, please make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more exciting content. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your likes, comments, and subscriptions mean the world to us and help us create more stories that you'll love. Stay tuned for more, and once again, thank you for being part of this journey with us.